there's this problem in Canada where you have thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women. So much so that a public inquiry had to be called. So much so that the public inquiry found that this was genocide, that this is an ongoing genocide that is occurring in this country, and that it's not being properly addressed. But why aren't the RCMP looking into this? Why aren't they investigating? And unfortunately, what a lot of information that is coming out now is revealing that the RCMP are also, unfortunately, part of the problem. All right, everyone, content warning. Obviously, we're going to be talking about some pretty intense subjects. If discussions of sexual assault or child abuse are things that will trigger you, perhaps step away for the next 20 to 30 minutes as I read about this brand new expose that just came out called A Lingering Evil, From Residential Schools to Murdered Women by Brandy Morin. And again, they have their own trigger warning. This article contains or recounts scenes of rape that readers will find distressing and triggering. 57-year-old Mary Nikal flops down onto a blue Chesterfield couch. Her scruffy miniature black poodle sits at her feet. Mary is exhausted. She has given countless interviews. Oh, excuse me.
True.
Poutine Context says true. Thank you for the $10, Poutine Context. Mary is exhausted. She's given countless interviews to the press over the past 30 years, but they still don't get any easier. Her hair, dyed a warm caramel brown, is tied back into a low ponytail. Her bangs, with their strands of gray, frame hazel eyes, similar to those of her little sister, Delphine. Delphine's pictures are displayed on a nearby table, illuminated by candlelight. She was 16 years old when she disappeared in 1990, one of the 3 members of the Nikal family to have vanished. All of them under 20, all of them female. Less than a year before Delphine disappeared, her 15-year-old cousin, Cecilia Nikal, went missing from Vancouver. A year before that, in 1988, another cousin, 19-year-old Roberta Nikal, disappeared near the city of Surrey in British Columbia. This is the locations of all 3 of them in British Columbia. She wasn't a runaway, says Mary of Delphine, as the rays from the setting sun settled upon the houseplants that lined the windows of her mobile home in an acreage town of Hazelton. I was thinking the worst for years. She was either in the river, someone beat her, or raped her, someone overpowered her because she was pretty strong, she says, informing a fist. This is a picture of her, a good life. Delphine was the youngest of 5 siblings. Her Dutch father was 49 when he met and married the wet-sweating mother, who was just 17 at the time, but they had a good life, Mary says. The family lived a few kilometers down outside of Smithers on the farm surrounded by snow-capped mountains. They kept pigs, chicken, goats, cows, horses, and dogs. Delphine had a deep affection for animals, Mary said, and an attraction to mischief. One time when Delphine was 3, we lost her. We were all looking all over, and Dad found her sitting in the garden eating strawberries. Her mouth was strained red. Delphine was exceptionally close to her father, who liked to spoil her, says Mary. It was their mother, Judy Nikal, who enforced the rules, handing out the chores to the children. Mary attributes her mother's sternness to the fact that she was a residential school survivor. Canada's residential schools. Between the late 1800s and 1990, more than 150 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools. A settlement deal with the government recognized 139 such institutions, which aimed to assimilate the children into the Canadian mainstream against their will. The notorious abuse state of the church-run schools to which Indigenous parents were forced to send their children under threat of arrest unleashed the sort of trauma that would be passed on through generations. Judy attended LeJac Residential School. It operated from 1922 to 1976 and was run by the Roman Catholic Church with the aim of forcing Indigenous children to assimilate into settler culture while forcibly removing them from their own culture, communities, and families. Abuse of all kinds was rampant, but there was only one story in particular that came to define LeJac in the minds of many Indigenous people. In 1937, 4 young boys ran away from the school, but before they could make it home, they froze to death on a nearby lake. Mom went through a lot of pain and suffering she never dealt with. Mary, her eyes were distant and filled with tears. Everything changed for the siblings when the father died of a heart attack. Delphine was just 9 years old, Mary was 20. The whole family fell apart. As the only child still living at home, Delphine moved with her mother and her mother's boyfriend, McGee, to Telqua, a village located just outside of Smithers. Mary says none of the children liked Mickey too much because she was an alcoholic and angry most of the time. One time, Delphine got so mad that Mickey, she punched him and broke a few of his ribs. She misses that fiery personality, she says. Oh, she was a strong independent. She was smart too, she says before adding, and she knew to keep in touch. By the time Mary was a busy mother of 3 young children, she'd always kept tabs on a little sister. Even then, age 14, she was sent away to an all-girls reform camp for several months and being charged with minor offenses. She misses her family a lot. She wrote us pages of long letters. She was such a good writer. Then she leans back, crosses her legs, and rests her chin on her hand. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, she reaches forward to pick up a photo of Delphine from the coffee table. For several minutes, Mary just looks at it. If Delphine had blonde hair and blue eyes. Before she went missing, Delphine was staying with her uncle Twelka while her mother was recuperating from a botched stomach surgery at a hospital in Prince George. The night she disappeared, June 13th, 1990, she had been hanging out with friends in Smithers and reportedly planned to hitchhike back to Twelka, which was 15 kilometers away. It was a common thing to do, Mary explains, as the public transportation between the small towns that reserves the line Highway 16 was and still is limited. But 2 days later, Mary got a call from her uncle telling her that Delphine never made it home. Her friends had seen her getting into a vehicle near a gas station in Smithers. Mary, then 26 years old, immediately began looking for her sister. She turned to Smithers Detachment to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to ask for help, but she didn't get any. The cops wouldn't listen to us. They weren't very concerned at all. We basically got the doors slammed in our face. So Mary had missing posters printed and put them up and around Smithers. She and organized searches in which volunteers joined the family to comb through the ditches along Highway 16. They went on for weeks, but Delphine was never found. Judy fell apart, Mary says. The cops weren't nice to my mum. She would spill her guts out trying to get the help. She cried every single night. Mary believes there was a lot of racism because Judy was Indigenous. If Delphine would have had blonde hair and blue eyes, the whole community would have cared. There would have been search parties, help with reward money, food would have been brought to feed searchers, it would have been on the news, people would have been helping their neighbors, but it wasn't like that. But her family misses her and loves her like anyone else. A perfect setting for a serial killer. Delphine's missing person case is still active and one of the 18 being investigated by RCMP's IPANA unit. Established in 2005, the unit was set up in a response to a series of murders and disappearance of mostly Indigenous women and girls along the Highway 16, or as it's known, the Highway of Tears. The purpose of the task force is to determine if a serial killer or killers is responsible for murdering young women traveling along the major highway in BC. So here's a picture of a whole bunch of women who have gone missing along the Highway of Tears. According to IPANA investigations, the Highway of Tears is a perfect setting for a killer. In the vast distances between the small towns and reserves that line it, it is a remote wilderness, rugged terrain, and animals that could feed on or carry away the remains of victims. Due to a lack of infrastructure, long stretches of the road still lack mobile phone services, all of which help perpetrators to cover their tracks, say the investigators. Mary has tried to move on from the trauma of her sister's disappearance, but it hasn't been easy. Her love for Delphine runs deep. Like a mother, she says she will probably shut herself in the bedroom for days after this interview. She explains, but the pain will be worth it as she helps her find out what happened to Delphine. She had hoped the dangers facing Indigenous women and girls would have lessened since her sister disappeared, but in the following years, many others have gone missing or been found dead. Advocates and family members say the number of missing and murdered could be as high as 50. 58-year-old Marion Duncan is standing outside the home where she works as a living career and companion of the elderly lady. It is her dream job, she explains, describing how they stay up together until all hours talking and playing cards. In the 1970s, home is located on an acreage and a 3-mile walk from Highway 16. Marion knows all the dangers of the highway. She started hitchhiking where she was a teenager, growing up in the Wet'suwet'en Nation around east of Smithers, and she still hitchhikes there today. She's not afraid. She believes the Lord will protect her. As bitterly cold wind blows strands of her dark brown hair and the sunlight reflects on the snow that covers the ground, she explains that she has been raped more than once while hitchhiking. But unable to afford a car with the limited public transportation along the highway, she will often hitch a ride on her days off to visit her children or to head to a medical appointment. When I'm determined to go somewhere, I'd rather go than wait for a ride. I often think about the women who were killed. When I'm walking on the side of the road, I'm always looking for ditches and stuff, thinking maybe I'll run into them or some of their belongings. Her eyes drift off into the distance as she begins to recount a time when she's almost ended up in one of those ditches. She was 14 years old when she and a friend hitched a ride to the Highway 16 near Vanderhoof, where they were headed to the bright lights near Prince George an hour away. My friend and I looked at each other. We were so afraid. When the vehicle slowed down, she said there was something terrible about what was about to happen. At that age, I didn't know any better. I was never warned about what a man can do. Marion said she wasn't taught about sex at school and the LeJac residential school. Both girls jumped out of the car and hid in the bushes on the side of the road. The man searched for them for what seemed like hours, but the girls eventually managed to escape, making their way back to Highway 16 where they hitched another ride. I didn't care or regret it. All that matters to me was that I was alive. With no other way to turn around carrying the pain and trauma of the residential school, Marion continued to hitchhike. It was mainly white men between the ages of 30 and 50 who would pick her up, she says. Then, when she was 17, Marion had another bad encounter, but this time she didn't manage to get away. A middle-aged white man had stopped to pick her up. He was quiet but friendly, she says. But then about 45 minutes later, he turned into a rural back road. I jumped out of the van, but he quickly came around and grabbed me, she recalls, shivering at the memory. He brought me back to the van, opened both doors, and I had no chance to run away. He was overpowering me. He put me in the back of the van. That's when she noticed the rifle. Marion says she felt helpless, alone, and lost in fear. I did what I had to do to survive. I knew that if I didn't fight back, I was going to die, she says. In my mind, I thought, just get over this and get it done so that you can get out of this alive. Then he raped her. Marion said she felt numb and an eerie sense of calm. I had no choice but to let him have his way. Then he drove her to Prince George and offered her a bottle of whiskey. Marion didn't drink. He felt insulted by his assumption that because she was Indigenous, she must have been drunk. So when she got out of the van, she threw the bottle into a bush and tried to do the same with the memory of what he had done to her. her. It wasn't the last time she was raped. But despite that, Marianne says she's not afraid of the murderous highway of tears. Maybe the other women and girls who have been killed or gone missing had the same fearless spirit, she wonders. As perpetrators of violence, she's clear of what they are. Cowards. They like to prey on women, and maybe they're prejudiced, she adds. It's easy to hitch a ride, Marion says. To prove her point, she walks around the shoulders of the Highway 16 and sticks out her thumb. It is a bleak, haunting place surrounded by wilderness. Every few minutes, a trucker vehicle passes by. Within 5 minutes, a gray-haired white man in a farm truck has stopped and offered a ride. When she explains that she doesn't actually need one, the man shakes his head, hits the gas hard, and drives off. It's that easy, she says with a shrug. Marion says she had looked to learn for signs of threatening behavior and take precautions. She removes the ties of her hoodie and never carries a weapon because she says those things could be used against her. I look for body language, how he talks. Some like to whistle or hum, tap fingers on the steering wheel. That's a red flag to me, she explains. I'm constantly looking in the rearview mirror. I leave my DNA in a vehicle, like I pretend to wipe my mouth or spit in my hand and wipe it on the seat or the floor, to leave a handprint on a smooth surface that leaves behind strands or hair tissue and tuck it away somewhere in the vehicle. Basically fucking having to create evidence in real time. There is no consent here. Just outside the town of Houston, 3 hereditary chiefs are visiting their Wet'suwet'en traditional territories. It is a land teeming with wildlife and traditional medicines. It is where the remains of ancestors are buried. But now this land is also teeming with workers constructing the Coastal GasLink liquefied natural gas pipeline. The security team and RCMP patrol unit is there on standby to protect the pipeline from its opponents. Among its many opponents are the Wet'suwet'en traditional leaders who believe the pipeline project threatened to destroy the environment and the way of life of Wet'suwet'en people, that they're working to preserve the future generations. And with the harm of the land comes the harm to the people, particularly to women and their chiefs. Their hereditary chiefs, Chief Damok and Sayu Beaver, clan of the Wet'suwet'en, systemic racism, violence against indigenous women and girls, and abuse of the land are deeply intertwined. There's no consent here and unaligned. Today, the prolific storyteller of the Wet'suwet'en history, culture, and land rights is chain smoking. It upsets him to see all his territories like this. There's a direct connection of violence against our women with this industry. If you ever hear about the number of years we've got the highway of tears, there's a development started. Most of the time, the words of women will be pushed aside. He believes the industry treats indigenous people as less than human and attributes this to systemic racism. You have an industry with no monitoring and no government to let them have free reign. They think they're above the law. No, the law is for everyone. Ugliness draws ugliness. A couple of kilometers east, smoke rises from the roof of a dozen rows of white and blue modular structures. This is a labor camp, a man camp as they're commonly referred to, housing workers building the CGL pipeline. The camp sits along Highway 16 and across a gravel road from the camp and its site where the Lejac Residential School once stood. The buildings were demolished because decades ago the cemetery and memorial remain. It is a sorrowful sacred place of mourning from what has been taken and what has been lost here, says 71-year-old survivor David Dennis. He attended the school in 1958 when he was 9 years old to 1965. When CGL built this large camp for the former residential school, it was a desecration. It rubbed salt in the wounds of what happened to him at Lejac, he says. Abuse is too distressing for him to talk about. It is as if the CGL is repeating the harms of the past by housing workers there who are harming indigenous territories and posing a threat to indigenous women. He reflects during a phone call from his home, which sits across the Fraser Lake in sight of the former school. Every time we saw the site of Lejac Residential School, it was an ugly sight for the survivors, says the respected elder who has 12 grandchildren and 5 great-grandparents. It was a prison. We weren't allowed to speak our language or even speak our own sisters. It was a sin for boys to speak to girls, but look what they did to us. So when I see the camp, my stomach turns, just like my stomach turned when Lejac was there. He believes an evil presence lingered there, he says, after indigenous communities prayed and held ceremonies to cleanse the land. But since the man camp arrived, he says the evil has returned. Ugliness draws ugliness. The man camp is ugly. The people that are going there are going to feel that ugliness and are probably going to end up doing ugly things. Rape and other forms of violence are going to happen. I know that. The TC Energy, the company behind the CGL pipeline project, declined a request to be included in an interview, but did email a statement saying that it recognizes and takes seriously the concerns about gender and sexualized violence against indigenous women, a broad social issue that transcends the industry. Susan Wilton, TC Energy's communication manager, wrote that CGL has engaged with indigenous and local communities during the development of the project and that it employs indigenous advisors who live and work to accommodation sites to promote an inclusive workplace and that the camps are designed with communities in mind. But these measures are not enough for David. He wants the camps and the pipeline out of his territory. He also wants to see indigenous-run security forces patrolling the highways. For our people to feel safe, we would have to have our own security system. There's no real safety for indigenous people here and now. Most of the cases of the women and girls who've gone missing or been found murdered remain unsolved. But in 2014, British Columbia's youngest known serial killer, Cody Lejabokov, who was 19 when he began his killing spree, was sentenced to 4 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. His victims were 35-year-old Jill Sachenko, 35-year-old Cynthia Mast, 25-year-old Natasha Montgomery, and 15-year-old Lauren Don Leslie. Cynthia and Natasha were indigenous. He was caught in November 2010 when a police officer pulled him over for speeding after seeing him driving onto Highway 27 from a rarely used logging road about 40 kilometers north of the city of Vanderhoof. The officer noticed blood on his face and clothes. It led to a search of the area and lifeless but still warm body of Lauren Dawn Leslie, who was legally blind and was discovered soon after. Then in January 2019, British Columbia Supreme Court found 73-year-old Gary Taylor Handlin guilty of first-degree murder and the 1978 killing of 12-year-old Monica Jack. The Gitxaala First Nation girl was seen riding her bike along the highway adjacent to the Highway 16, city of Merritt in British Columbia. The remains of 17 years later. Handlin, who had multiple sexual assault convictions dating back to 1969, was arrested in 2014 after confessing to Monica's murder during an undercover police operation. Meanwhile, Mary Nikal wasn't sure if she would ever find closure over the disappearance of her sister. Several years ago, the family filled out official paperwork to officially pronounce Delphine dead, but they haven't held a memorial for her because there are too many unanswered questions and it's still painful to let go. Mary's tear began to fall and her voice breaks when she said, "I've suffered along the way, not grieving. My world needs a little peace now. I hope she's with my dad." Her poodle scratches her feet as she bends down to pick her up. Then with clenched fist, she says, "I hope her spirit's strong enough to haunt the guy that killed her. I sometimes hope that whoever hurt her pays in hell." Now, I know a handful of people are probably hearing this like incredibly sad story. I think Brandy Morin did a really good job of connecting so many different things. I know, I'm sorry to start things off with such a dark story, but I think it really does need to be told. It's part of a, again, 4-part series that Brandy Morin has been doing and reporting on. And she's been doing a really, really good job of connecting so many different parts. Because in and of itself, I know that the claims of, like, that's just systemic racism, or that's just institutional racism, or this is just an example of something terrible that happened in the past, and we should acknowledge it, but at the same time, we should move on kind of stuff, right? You have to connect both the intergenerational trauma, the fact that the government of Canada to this day underfunds the reserve system and the very programs that are supposed to help children become underfunded, intentionally underfunded by the government of Canada, which results in a whole bunch of problems such as neglect, such as poor living conditions, such as unclean drinking water in over 40 reserves in the country, some of which the drinking water is actually like, it's literally black and is resulting in a whole bunch of medical problems for people who don't have, again, adequate medical facilities in these places. So it has been going on since the whatever you want to call it, Canadian project began. The RCMP, which is where this next part comes in, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they were established, the very formation of them, this federal police force, they were established to control the Indian problem. That's the entire, like, that is in their actual, like, you can go on Wikipedia, you can see their history, and you can see their actual establishment and their creed. Like, this is not something that is like, oh, a hidden secret. This is publicly available information for anyone who wants to study the history. People wonder often, well, okay, fine. There's this problem in Canada where you have thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women. So much so that a public inquiry had to be called. So much so that the public inquiry found that this was genocide, that this is an ongoing genocide that is occurring in this country, and that it's not being properly addressed. But why aren't the RCMP looking into this? Why aren't they investigating? And unfortunately, what a lot of information that is coming out now is revealing that the RCMP are also, unfortunately, part of the problem. That brings us to this.
I have every reason to believe that the RCMP, some of the RCMP officers are responsible for the demise of our women, particularly up here on the Highway of Tears. It's been in their history. I know their history. I've been there. I've been raped by them. Because they can. They're the biggest gang in the world. They're in control.
Why aren't they doing it to white girls?
No rhyme nor reason. No, other than racism. The hate they have for First Nations women. I think that has a lot to do with it. And we have to remember that the RCMP were formed to control the Indian problem. It's written right in the history books. You can look in Wikipedia and you will find it in their mission statement. Nothing's changed since 1863.
Yeah, I agree with that statement, Checkered Squares. I think also, like, if the victims were predominantly white of sexual abuse, then it would probably call for a lot more media attention. Whereas the Highway of Tears is not a new phenomenon. Perhaps everyone's understanding of it is, but the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country have it's for a long time there was just absolute radio silence on this issue, both from the media and
we
from.
Have reports on Uganda like that, for sure. Not a lot, but we have them and we look at them. I'm dealing with a gentleman right now from another area of the country that's talking about a retired policeman. And we absolutely look at it. We've got DNA from police officers, not just to erase them from crime scene because they were there handling it as investigators, but for other reasons. But you know what? I've heard before, and I've said it before, I strongly encourage, I get all the history in the past to report it.
We encourage them to come forward. I personally come forward to meet with them and to encourage them to give us their story and absolutely be taken seriously and investigated appropriately, for sure. And just to add to Wayne's comments, for sure, and what I said before, how dare we ignore any piece of information? We wouldn't. We've seen it through the history of Canada. We've seen other cases where people you would never suspect of committing.
The full thing is available on Brandy Morin's, again, 4-part article that she put together. That was the 4th part I read, but it starts in the first one. Obviously, like it's very heavy. I would only recommend if you're in a good headspace to go through all 4 parts. But yeah, reading it last night, I was like, it's absolutely harrowing how she does it, and she does an incredible job of connecting all the dots of both what has happened in the past and what is happening in the present, and why there should be more calls for justice in regards to this entire issue. Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Juste, we beseech thee to smite down our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble court jesters, here to amuse you. To our lords, Trevor R., we give thanks for this spit of land for us to eke out this meager existence. To our knights, Merid, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Ellie Leslie, Alex P., Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Val 9000, Jenna Tall, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Yanis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojack, Saren 42, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our flag in a veil, and we salute you, our friends.